Name's Tammy Mitchell. I'm the Director of the Office of Electric, Gas, and Water at the Department of Public Service. I have been designated to serve as the alternate representing the chair of the New York State Board on Electric Generating Siting and the Environment, or as it is also known, the Siting Board. I call this meeting of the Siting Board to order. Before moving on to the agenda, I'd like to introduce the alternates representing the permanent members of the Siting Board. Louis Alexander, representing the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Dr. Elizabeth Lewis Michael, alternate representing the Commissioner of the Department of Health. Vincent Ravishir, alternate representing the Commissioner of the New York State Department of Economic Development. And John Williams, alternate representing the Chair of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Secretary Phillips, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Thank you. We will begin with case 20-F-0043, application of Garnet Energy Center LLC for a certificate of environmental compatibility and public need pursuant to Article 10 to construct and operate a solar generating facility and energy storage system in the town of Conquest, Cayuga County. Presented by Maureen Leary, Administrative Law Judge, Department of Public Service. Dakin Lee Cakes, Chief Administrative Law Judge, Department of Public Service. Jason Zaire, Chief of Environmental Certification and Compliance, Office of Electric, Gas, and Water, Department of Public Service, and Robert Rosenthal, General Counsel, are available for questions. Judge Leary, please begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair-Designate Mitchell and members of the Siting Board. The proposed order on rehearing before you denies the petition brought by intervener, the Rural Preservation and Net Conservation Benefit Coalition, which I will refer to during my presentation as Rural Preservation. The rehearing petition challenges the Siting Board's October 28, 2022 order that issued a Certificate of Environmental Compatibility and Public Need with conditions to Garnet Energy Center LLC pursuant to Article 10 of the Public Service Law. The Siting Board Certificate Order authorizes Garnet to construct and operate a 200 megawatt commercial scale solar generation facility, which includes a 20 megawatt energy storage facility, 12.3 miles of access roads, 25.5 miles of underground collection system lines, a 2.7 acre switchyard, a collection system substation, parking areas, construction laydown yards, point of interconnection facilities, and other associated facility components. The facility will be located on 2,288 acres in the town of Conquest, Cayuga County, of which approximately 901 acres will be used for the solar panel and associated component installation and will be surrounded by fencing. I want to go through the Siting Board's initial October 28, 2022 certificate order. As the Siting Board may recall, its order approving the project was based on an extensive and fully developed record with participation from staff of the Department of Public Service, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Agriculture and Markets, the town of Conquest, and multiple interveners, including Rural Preservation. The certificate order includes 149 conditions and a detailed site engineering and environmental plan, or SEEP plan, provisions. Those documents are designed to address and or minimize or avoid the project's potential environmental and other impacts. In its order, the Siting Board expressly found that the project's potential impacts had been adequately identified, and with the certificate conditions and SEEP provisions, those impacts would be minimized or avoided to the maximum extent practicable. This includes impacts to protected, threatened, and endangered avian species. And of note, as you will hear later in my presentation, the rehearing petition focuses on those impacts. In the certificate order, the Siting Board also expressly found that the project is designed to comply with applicable substantive requirements of state laws and regulations, including laws governing the protection of threatened and endangered species, which are set forth in Environmental Conservation Law Article 11 and the underlying implementing regulations set forth in 6 NYCRR Part 182. I turn now to the proposed order on rehearing, that is before you today, which affirms the findings set forth in the Siting Board's underlying certificate order, insofar as they are relevant to the issues raised in rural preservation's rehearing petitions. Let me go through some of the assertions in the rehearing petition and identify what the proposed order on rehearing addresses. As a threshold matter, the proposed order before you finds that the rehearing petition does not meet the criteria for granting rehearing under Article 10, specifically Public Service Law Section 170 and the Article 10 rehearing regulations in 16 NYCRR Section 1000.15. Those provisions require a petitioning party to show that the Siting Board committed an error of law or fact that would justify the reversal in whole or in part of the certificate order. The rehearing petitioner must also show, or may show, that new circumstances warrant a different determination than that which the Siting Board reached in the certificate order. The proposed order on rehearing before you finds that rural preservation has failed to substantiate any error of law or fact and fails to present new circumstances justifying the Siting Board changing its determination. Although the order on rehearing finds that rural preservation has not made the required showing for rehearing, it nevertheless addresses the substantive merits of the claims raised in the petition. First, the rehearing petition asserts that the project's impacts to avian species have not been adequately identified. Specifically, the petition asserts that Garnet's avian surveys that were included in its application were flawed and did not accurately identify either the avian species in the project area or the project's potential impacts on such species. The rehearing petition alleges that Garnet underestimated the number of species that would be killed or injured as a result of the project, and that the Siting Board improperly relied on Garnet's flawed application. Rural preservation, in support of this claim, repeats the testimony presented by its avian experts during the proceeding. That testimony discussed several avian mortality studies undertaken at solar facilities located in California. These California studies documented higher fertility incidences than those that were initially estimated before those projects were built. Rural preservation concludes here that the same will occur for this project. Rural preservation's experts also assert that the project would have a, quote, lake effect impact on avian and aquatic species. So, for example, ducks and other aquatic species would perceive the solar panels to be a water body and would land on them, thereby resulting in injury or death. In rebuttal, Garnet's experts refuted the applicability of these studies because they were done primarily in California desert environments with different kinds of species. Those environments are much different than the ecosystem in which this project will be located, according to Garnet. Garnet also asserts that Article 10 does not require precise mortality estimates. Garnet argues that rural preservation did not, on the record, present its own studies of avian or surveys of avian impacts in the project area in order to prove the potential for greater site-specific mortality numbers. Garnet also argues that rural preservation had a full and fair opportunity during the proceeding to present such evidence of site-specific impacts, potential impacts, and yet failed to do so. The rehearing order before you today agrees with Garnet's position in this regard and notes that nothing in the record supports rural preservation's comparison of the California facilities with this project. Nothing supports its claims of a potential lake effect impact from the project's solar panels. As the Siting Board did in the order granting the certificate, the proposed rehearing before you today relies on record testimony, including that of the Department of Environmental Conservation's Threatened and Endangered Species Witness, who indicated that occupied habitat for any threatened and endangered species has not been documented in the project area. As the rehearing order notes, this testimony undercuts rural preservation's arguments that avian species in the project area have not been accurately identified. The rehearing order also finds that rural preservation's claims of unidentified project impacts are speculative. The rehearing petition next claims that avian impacts have not been sufficiently minimized or avoided to the maximum extent practicable. Rural preservation asserts that additional protective measures should be required as a part of the certificate. Rural preservation specifically challenges Certificate Condition 105, which provides for Garnet to submit as a compliance filing a post-construction avian monitoring plan and to implement the plan over a 3-year period. As noted in the application and the certificate order, the avian monitoring plan is intended to gather information and data regarding the project's potential post-construction avian impacts and to document the use of the project area by threatened and endangered breeding and wintering avian species. Condition 105 in the certificate requires the plan to include detailed breeding and wintering bird surveys and studies and numerous other details associated with those surveys and studies. The rehearing petition argues that the Siting Board should have identified more details in the methodology and substance of the post-construction avian monitoring plan required in Condition 105. In response, Garnet argues on rehearing that rural preservation's argument, if accepted, would be both sweeping and costly. The rehearing order before you finds that both Department of Public Service staff and DEC staff have extensive expertise and experience to determine the plan's details in consultation with Garnet. It rejects the premise that greater detail is required in Condition 105. The rehearing order also notes that the plan will be provided to rural preservation as a compliance filing, at which time it will have the opportunity to provide input to both Garnet and the involved agencies. As part of its challenge that project impacts have not been minimized or avoided to the maximum extent practicable, the rehearing petition focuses on one sentence in Condition 105, which indicates that the findings from the avian monitoring plan, quote, will not trigger additional surveys or additional mitigation and will not result in changes to operations of the project. The rehearing petition argues that this sentence prevents DPS and DEC from imposing additional post-construction mitigation measures to protect avian species at the project site if the monitoring plan indicates that further action is necessary and should be required. The proposed rehearing order rejects rural preservation's narrow reading of this sentence in Condition 105. It reviews several related certificate conditions that each separately and together provide for specific minimization, avoidance, and/or mitigation measures to be implemented at all phases of the project's development and operation if threatened and endangered species are observed in the project area. These measures are required during construction and restoration activities or during post-construction facility operation and maintenance. The order on rehearing notes that Condition 105 should be viewed in the context of these other applicable certificate conditions. They are specifically Conditions 99 through 104. These conditions, when reviewed together with Condition 105, require further action to minimize or avoid project impacts during all phases. For example, these conditions require the cessation of activities in certain areas if threatened or endangered species are discovered or observed, including if they are observed displaying what is called, quote, essential behaviors, such as breeding, nesting, roosting, feeding, foraging, etc. These conditions provide that the certificate holder must report the discovery to DEC and identify the minimization, avoidance, and/or mitigation measures that will be taken or have been taken. Once a species is observed, construction and other nearby activities cannot recommence without DEC approval. The rehearing order reviews other certificate conditions that require minimization and avoidance measures, including the preservation of trees in areas where roosting of species is observed, the avoidance of those areas and the establishment and posting of buffer zones, creation of visual barriers, the avoidance of blasting and other loud activities during specific time frames. These conditions also require the certificate holder to train project personnel, that is the employees involved in construction, restoration, operations, and maintenance activities. They will be trained to identify listed species and take appropriate action as required by the certificate conditions. The conditions also provide that Garnet may propose, it is not required, may propose and implement additional minimization, avoidance, and/or mitigation measures to protect the species with DEC's approval. In addition to these measures, the rehearing order notes that the certificate conditions also require Garnet to retain an environmental monitor to assure compliance with the conditions, including those related to threatened and endangered species. The environmental monitor is empowered to issue stop work orders as necessary to protect, for example, threatened and endangered bat species. These certificate conditions and the SEEP guide also require Garnet to submit an environmental compliance and monitoring plan with additional requirements noted to protect avian species. Again, rural preservation will have the opportunity to comment on this plan in the compliance phase. The rehearing order before you concludes that when viewed together, the relevant certificate conditions and SEEP provisions support the Siting Board's finding that the project's potential adverse environmental impacts, including those to threatened and endangered avian species, will be minimized and avoided to the maximum extent practicable. Based on the findings in the Siting Board's prior order and the record as a whole, we recommend the Siting Board's adoption of the proposed order on rehearing before you today. This concludes my presentation. We are, of course, available to respond to any questions that the members of the Siting Board may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Leary, for your comprehensive summary of this item before us. I believe the proposed order denying Rural Preservation's rehearing petition is appropriate in that the petition did not meet the standard for rehearing, and I'll be supporting the item. Let me turn to my fellow board members for any comments or questions. Mr. Alexander.
Thank you. I would like to express my thanks to ALJ Leary for her presentation today. I particularly appreciate the overview of the interplay of the certificate conditions that are applicable here. Like her presentations in our prior proceedings, ALJ Leary's presentation today has provided me with a very helpful review. Madam Chair, I have no further comments.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis Michael?
No comments or questions.
Mr. Ravishir?
No questions or comments.
Mr. Williams?
No questions or comments.
I now call for a vote. My own vote is in favor of the recommendation as described. Mr. Alexander, how do you vote?
I vote in favor.
Dr. Lewis Michael?
In favor.
Mr. Ravishir?
In favor.
Mr. Williams?
In favor.
The order is approved and the recommendation is adopted. Secretary Phillips, is there anything further to come before us today?
There's nothing further.
Thank you. We are adjourned.